On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Think for a moment. How many weddings would you say that you have been to in your life? 10? 20? 50? To be honest, I've lost count. Although I was just at one yesterday afternoon. I would guess that if pushed, you could recall something about most of those weddings. What the bride wore, the music that was played, the songs you danced to at the reception, some funny moment. Perhaps when the best man dropped the ring and had to chase it down the aisle. Or when the groom became so overwhelmed by emotion that he threw up on the altar. Or the groom who broke down in huge, gasping sobs that went on so long that the bride actually told him in a voice loud enough for the entire church to hear to pull it together. Or the time that a bride stood too close to a candle but didn't become bride flambe, thanks only to the quick thinking of her maid of honor who whipped off her veil, stamped it out to put out the fire, replaced the charred remains on the bride's head, and then calmly nodded that we could proceed. And yes, should you be wondering, those are all true stories, and I was there to witness every one of them. The things they don't tell you in seminary. I could write a book. Whether you enjoy weddings or dread them, they make an impression. You can recall details of a wedding many years after they happen. How the light caught her eyes, how the champagne tasted, who caught the bouquet. It's not just any day a wedding day. It's a day that strives for goodwill, for abundance and joy. Despite the fact that every wedding is a bit of a cliche and they're all somewhat alike, despite the army of wedding professionals waiting to capitalize on your special day, and the fact that many marriages don't end up happily ever after, a wedding remains a basic metaphor for things turning out right in the end. Which is exactly why this wedding in Cana of Galilee, with its water-to-wine miracle, marks the beginning of Jesus' public ministry in the Gospel of John. John is setting the scene for everything that comes after and telling us what he thinks life as a follower of Jesus is really about. As the author Marcus Borg writes in his book titled simply Jesus, the entire story of Jesus is about a wedding between God and God's people. More, it is a wedding at which the wine never runs out. And even more than that, it is a wedding at which the best wine is saved for last. Of the four gospel writers, John is unique, marching to the beat of his own drummer. John clearly thinks that this is a very important story for understanding just who Jesus is and what he is about. And yet this wedding water wine miracle story, perhaps the best known and well-remembered miracle of all Jesus' miraculous acts, the account of this wedding miracle occurs only in his gospel. The other three gospels make no mention of Jesus ever turning water into wine. Our lectionary runs in a 3-year cycle, 1 year each for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Unlike the other three gospelers, John doesn't get a year dedicated just to him. Instead, we get little bits and pieces of John scattered throughout each of the 3 years. Where Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell variations of the same basic story about Jesus, John goes off in his own direction. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more narrative, sticking to the facts and the chronology of Jesus' life and inserting Jesus' teachings as it was preserved.